History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more. David Fleming is the author of Breaker Boys, the NFL's greatest team and the stolen 1925 championship. David, the Pottsville Maroons are the subject of your book. 1925, they were the leading team in the nascent NFL. Take us back to Pottsville in the 1920s. What kind of a town was it?
Oh, it was a town that just epitomized the Roaring Twenties, right? Anything was possible. There was sort of like this melting pot of races, religions, families. Pottsville, coal mining and coal miners, especially in Pennsylvania, they were the fuel for one of the greatest industrial revolutions in the history of the world. And it felt like at times in the Roaring Twenties that Pottsville was sort of the capital of that entire movement.
Now today, professional sports are big business. The NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA. But back in those days, things were not quite developed yet. So what did the professional landscape look like?
Yeah, I think a player who played back then said professional football at the time ranked last behind college football, boxing, horse racing, baseball, and synchronized swimming. So for the longest time, college football was king, especially in the 1920s. And people found it sort of undignified to play football for money, especially on Sundays. And so the NFL, I think it's a really good point you make. It's to put it in context. It's very hard to put it in context for modern day fans that 31 of the first 43 NFL franchises went bankrupt because the NFL people just wouldn't support it at the time. So it was chaotic, it was violent, it was colorful, but it was holding on by a thread most seasons.
When was the modern NFL created?
I think a lot of people trace it to the 1950s with the infusion of television money. And once television money came in as a second source of revenue, the NFL was going to be okay. And that's why in 1958, after the Colts beat the Giants in sudden death overtime in New York, a game that 45 million people watched. That's why the commissioner at the time, Bert Bell, was weeping after the game because he knew once television had kicked in that the NFL was going to survive.
Now, back in the 1920s, could players make a living playing professional football?
It depended on who you played for. If you played for a team like Pottsville that had deep pockets, you absolutely could. And in fact, that was one of the things that made Pottsville so unique is that they required the players, instead of barnstorming and showing up just for the games, they required their players to sort of be professional, to come to Pottsville, to live in Pottsville, to practice. And so if you're on the right team, you really could make a living. And especially in Pottsville, you could make a living outside of the coal mines. And I think once a few of those players realized that they could earn just as much money playing football instead of being buried in the coal mines, it was a no-brainer for them.
So for players at that time, what would it have been like to step on the field?
Oh my gosh. Well, they would have had almost no protective, no protective equipment, no helmets. Duke Osborne, one of the famous linemen for the Pottsville Maroons, he was famous because he wore a baseball cap as his helmet. So these were very, very rough and tough men. They sometimes, if games were particularly hard, they would stuff the game programs into their uniforms for a little extra padding. But it was usually sort of a makeshift field and sort of making it up as they go along. But it was the main requirement to survive in the NFL was a high tolerance for pain.
Now, we'll be looking at the 1925 season. But when was the NFL established?
1920. So that's what makes the Maroons such an influential and important team, is that this is at the infancy of the NFL, when from season to season, from week to week, no one was sure if it was even going to survive. So this is right at the time, and the game is sort of wide open. People are sort of experimenting with throwing the ball. The rules are sort of changing from week to week. And the organization is sort of changing and growing every day. So Pottsville really was a monumental, important team about the birth of the NFL.
Did professional football really have a mountain to climb when competing for fans with college football?
Oh yeah, mountain, maybe 10 mountains. People just wouldn't take it seriously. People loved college football. And again, I know this is Pottsville Maroons focus, but that is one of the reasons why the Maroons were so important to the NFL, is they helped that transition. They proved to people that the NFL, that a team of professionals could be just as good, just as entertaining, just as fun to watch as college football. And I think the NFL still owes Pottsville a debt of gratitude for what they did.
When was the Pottsville Maroons itself created?
Oh, they go all the way back several years to what people called maybe the toughest football league in the history of football. They started in the Anthracite Coal League, where I think essentially these tiny little towns, coal mining towns in Northeast Pennsylvania, they're either their sort of local talent, or they would pull people out of the coal mines and they would create a team and they would play each other, and the rivalries were intense, the rivalries were violent. And so the history of the Maroons, the basis of the Maroons, is always from this sort of the heart of anthracite coal mining country. It seems like they never lost that identity. They were uh, a tough team to play.
So the team existed before the NFL was created, correct?
Yeah. It was only when Pottsville got so good that they were beating up everybody around them. And it got to the point where teams wouldn't play them, or fans would shoot up their train as it was leaving town because the Maroons had beaten up their local 11 so thoroughly. That's when they realized, well, we need better competition. And that is when Doc Striegel, their legendary owner, said, well, let's try and get in the NFL.
Let's talk about Doc Striegel. Who is he?
Oh God, just one of the all-time great characters in the history of the NFL, the history of Pottsville. He was just a wealthy doctor, sort of the town doctor in Pottsville. Everybody knew him. He was sort of at the top of the social hierarchy in Pottsville. And he was a former football player, and he loved football. He just loved it. And he was the one who decided, let's rally the town, let's raise some money, and let's put our boys, our 11, against everybody. People from Pottsville, people from Green Bay, New York. Let's see what we can do against the rest of the country.
How did the team get into the NFL?
Well, back then, I mean, this is what's so great about this story. Back then, I mean, honestly, all you had to do was petition the NFL and pay the $500 entrance fee, and you were in. And that is essentially what happened with Doc Striegel and the Maroons. There was a benefit that the NFL was looking for another team close to the East Coast, where teams from like Chicago, Green Bay, Detroit, Cleveland, those teams could pick up another game to help defray the travel cost going to New York. And so one of the great things about this story is Pottsville was let in just as sort of like a patsy. The NFL thought they could pick up some gate receipts. These teams could beat up this tiny little coal town team and move in and out of the East Coast. And instead, Pottsville ended up just beating up and dominating every team that showed up.
Well, take us to the beginning of the 1925 season. Set us up. Who were the key teams that Pottsville was going up against, and how did the season begin for them?
Yeah, back then, I mean, it's actually very similar, right? The Green Bay Packers were incredible. The Canton Bulldogs were one of the early dominant teams in the NFL, back-to-back champions in the early 20s. There were teams in New York, teams in Philadelphia, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who would eventually become the Philadelphia Eagles. They were a rival, and there were teams in Chicago. The Arizona Cardinals, they originated as the Chicago Cardinals, and that was another big rival of the Maroons. And one by one, they came into town and just got absolutely obliterated by the coal miners.
So, was there a moment where people realized that this team was for real?
It was. They were Pottsville they had dominated, but they had also had a fluke loss. And back then, I think as people know, the champion was determined by, standings, by winning percentage. And so I think even back then, if you lost a second game or a third game, you would be out of the running for the championship. So Pottsville has a fluke loss, and then the next game they're facing the Canton Bulldogs, and they can't lose again. And that Canton is when everything came together, and they absolutely dominated Canton, and they didn't look back after that.
Uh, were the Canton Bulldogs surprised that they got beat so handily?
I think everybody, that's such a good point. I think everybody in the NFL was not just surprised, they were embarrassed. They just couldn't believe they went to this tiny little unheard of coal mining town and got embarrassed on the football field. And that ends up coming back to really sort of bite the Maroons in the backside because they started collecting enemies. The Green Bay Packers weren't used to getting shut out, and the Canton Bulldogs didn't like getting beat up. And same thing for just right down the line. And so, as the Maroons are dominating, they're also collecting enemies throughout the NFL.
Talk about the Maroons as a team. Who are some of the key players? And you talked earlier about barnstorming, where players would show up for a game. How did that impact teamwork, and how did the Maroons kind of overcome that to build a team?
Yeah, and I think this is again another one of the Maroons' great contributions to the early NFL is that they decided to do things differently. They brought in Dick Rauch, who was a former Penn State player and a renowned sort of strategist as their coach. He doubled as a government ornithologist, which I just absolutely love. So he knew about sort of scouting and note taking and sort of an organization. And so Rauch and Striegel, they brought people in. They basically brought in this great mixture of expensive free agents throughout the NFL, which also sort of made other people mad throughout the NFL. Pennsylvania great college players, and then local coal miners. And it created this great mix of really smart football because they required the Maroons, unlike almost any other NFL team, they required them to practice every day and to do sort of strategy work and chalkboard work and all that stuff. And it really made the Maroons leapfrog almost everybody in the NFL. So they were smart, they were tough, and they practiced a lot. And so they had a huge advantage. Some of those, there were great local college players like Jack Ernst, who was a renowned quarterback at Lafayette. Charlie Berry was his wide receiver, who went on to become he was a famous baseball player. He was also a famous umpire and referee. And then there were all the sort of rough and tumble players like Duke Osborne, like Frankie Racis, and then really the star of the team, where it begins and ends, the heart of the Pottsville Maroons, um, was Tony Latone, their running back, a player who literally came out of the mines to join the Pottsville Maroons. And he was known because of his violent running style. He was known as the human howitzer. And if you can imagine, his style fit that name perfectly. He developed this incredible toughness, but also this incredible physique by pushing coal cars in the mines. And he really was, this isn't just me saying this is a lot of NFL historians. Tony Latone became probably the preeminent, the most successful running back of the entire 1920s NFL.
You say in the book that Doc Striegel and most of his contemporaries in the 20s abhorred the kind of trench warfare that teams like Canton tried to pass off as football. Well, how did they play, and how did Doc wanted to play?
Yes, I love that. It's critics of the NFL in the 1920s called it paid punting. It was basically a fancy form of rugby where it was the Philadelphia Eagles tush push on every play, just line plunging and sort of like just moving the ball back and forth. Not very exciting, not a great game to watch, just extremely violent. And where the Maroons differed was they could do that if they needed to. Tony Latone was happy to take on as many defenders as wanted to challenge him. But at the same time, Jack Ernst and Dick Rauch, they worked on different types of plays, different formations, downfield passes. They were much more closer to the Notre Dame Four Horsemen of the time. And that was revolutionary in the NFL, that kind of thinking.
Talk about the forward pass and what role it played in the game at that time.
Well, it was sort of people still weren't sure that it even should be legal, and people thought it was sort of cowardly to advance the ball that way instead of sort of facing people helmet to helmet. But it really opened up the game and it really made things exciting. And it couldn't have been any more perfect timing than to have Jack Ernst, who was sort of like that classic swashbuckler quarterback in the pocket who loved the idea of throwing long, they called them aerials, long aerials to people downfield and to sort of waving at the crowd as they came out of the huddle. I mean, Jack Ernst was sort of the perfect character for the growing and the experimental part of the passing game.
As the season continued on and the Maroons racked up win after win after win, eventually they make their way to Green Bay on November 26th. And what was the mood in the stadium there, and what was the expectation from the Green Bay team?
I think that this is where it ends. This is where it ends for the Maroons. That they're going to be sort of this is where they get their comeuppance, and because this is the Packers, right? This is the Green Bay Packers, and nobody does this to the Green Bay Packers. Well, the Maroons basically traveled across the country, showed up in Green Bay, and then shut out the Green Bay Packers 31-0. And at that point, it looked like everybody in the NFL couldn't believe that their champion was going to be this tiny little coal town in Pennsylvania.
Now, earlier in the season, the Maroons had lost to the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, but they returned after the Green Bay game. They returned to Frankfurt, or returned to a matchup with Frankfurt. And what happened in that game?
So I'm glad you brought that up. This is really a critical part of the season. Frankfurt and Pottsville are huge rivals, right? The fans hate each other. The towns hate each other. Frankfurt thought Pottsville was a hick town, and Pottsville thought Frankfurt was a fancy schmancy city town. So it was like this great early rivalry in the NFL. And Frankfurt had won the first game, and so basically this rematch was going to determine who would set up to be in place to sort of play the Chicago Cardinals in the West. Who would advance in the standings to play the Cardinals to determine who would be the NFL champion. So it was almost like a semifinal game of the NFL championship that season. And again, with everything on the line, Pottsville ends up beating them. I want to make sure I get it right, 49-0. So it was a huge statement that Pottsville was here. Pottsville was going to play for the championship. And they didn't just beat Frankfurt, they humiliated Frankfurt.
Now, you mentioned this before, but the championship, there was no championship game the way we think of it today, but it was by winning percentage. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think what they did is the NFL would let the teams all play each other, almost like a round robin tournament. And then as you got to December, the teams that had separated with a winning percentage, they would try to then play each other for the sort of unofficial NFL championship. And that's what happened. Once Pottsville destroyed Frankfurt, they and the Chicago Cardinals had sort of emerged as the top two teams in the NFL. And when they decided to play, Pottsville accepted an invitation to go to Chicago to play. All the newspapers referred to it as the game that would determine the NFL championship.
So Pottsville Maroons arrive in Chicago, meet the Chicago Cardinals on the gridiron. What happens?
Well, this is becoming almost like a broken record, right? Pottsville does this to everybody. But Pottsville, they're sort of they're beaten up from a season long. They agree to go all the way by train to Chicago. Tony Latone is hurt. So if Pottsville wasn't for real, it would have been very easy for them to sort of beg off and to sit out this game. But they wanted to win the championship on the field where it mattered. And so they agreed and they risked it all and they went all the way to Comiskey Park. And in a blinding, freezing snowstorm without their best player, Pottsville again crushed the Cardinals in the de facto championship game, 21-7. And as they were taking their train home, all the newspapers across the country were declaring them the NFL champions of 1925.
So at this point, was there an official declaration that they were the champions, or what happened after this?
I think if you go by like the headlines in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the Philadelphia papers, absolutely, it was sort of it was a foregone conclusion that Pottsville was they were the kings of the NFL in 1925, and no one's ever disputed the fact that they were absolutely the best team in professional football in 1925. So it was just a matter of them finishing out the season and collecting their championship.
Now, in your subtitle, you talk about a stolen championship. What happened?
So Pottsville, much like when they were in the Anthracite League, and they were like, "My gosh, we need to up our competition because we've beaten everybody." Pottsville, as in their first year in the NFL, that's what's hard to imagine. Their first year in the NFL, they crush everybody in the NFL, and at the end of the season, they think, "Well, who else is out there? We need better competition." And so what happens is there is a promoter decides, well, let's take the legendary let's take an all-star team of college players based on the legendary Notre Dame Four Horsemen, who again were considered the greatest football team ever assembled, and let's see what the NFL's best team, the Pottsville Maroons, let's see how they could do against a college team. And now we've talked about this a lot, Phil, that people had no respect for the NFL. And I think the idea was that the Notre Dame Four Horsemen would humiliate the NFL champions, and then the debate would be over that college football was still king. And so the Pottsville Maroons, they got temporary permission from the NFL to play in this game, and they set up to play the Notre Dame Four Horsemen in the original sort of college versus pros football game that was going to be held December 12th at Shibe Park in Philadelphia.
And so, as a consequence of this game, the Maroons would win 9-7. But what would happen after this?
So we talked about this. They humiliated the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, and the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets were back then. You got all your money through gate receipts. And so the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets were hoping that they would be the ones that would get to play Notre Dame and get all those gate receipts in Shibe Park, which was basically in their backyard. And when the Maroons sort of destroyed them and leapfrogged over them as the team that would play Notre Dame, Frankfurt decided to protest to the NFL to try and get Pottsville out of that game so that they could play it and get all the money. But Pottsville had gotten temporary permission from the NFL. They had signed their contracts, And they, even though the NFL was objecting and threatening them, Pottsville went ahead with the game. And like you said, I don't think you can overstate the fact that this was a turning point in the early NFL. That Pottsville beating the legendary Notre Dame Four Horsemen, that legitimized the NFL in 1925. The problem is for going against the NFL's wishes, the NFL decided to suspend Pottsville for playing Notre Dame and summarily strip them of the championship that they had earned on the field in Chicago.
What would you say is the legacy of the Pottsville Maroons?
Oh, I think it's just that they against all odds, they became a team in 1925 that helped legitimize the NFL. And to pay them back for that service, the NFL destroyed the team. They stole their championship, and they did harm to this great little town that has been fighting for a century now to correct this historical injustice.
Has there been any movement in the NFL to perhaps remedy the situation?
There's been discussions, and I think the biggest problem is it's the Cardinals, right? The Cardinals family, the Bidwell family, they have blocked not just Pottsville's argument. They won't let Pottsville even state its case, and so periodically there are movements to sort of to get Pottsville that championship, but the fight continues. The fight continues.
David Fleming is the author of The Breaker Boys, the NFL's greatest team, and the stolen 1925 championship. David, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.